Okay, so I should review. So lightning talks are strictly short presentations, 5 minutes, auto-advancing slides. The speakers don't get speaker notes. These speakers have prepared. I was very impressed with yesterday's. We have 7 speakers, 5 minutes each. There's 30 seconds between presenters. The slides advance every 15 seconds. We do allow demos that go more than one slide. So that means we've got 39 and a half minutes-ish of content in this 40-minute session, which is why we're so strict about things. Gray sign, that's how the speakers know they've got 30 seconds left. When it turns red, they've got to sit down. So it's always fun to see how it goes. Hey, look, I finished early. And I'll sit down.
All right. Everyone can hear me okay? Cool. All right, so my name is G. Lee. I am with Zia Consulting. I'm a solutions engineer and also a team lead for Zia. And I'm here today to talk about adding Alfresco actions to your inbox. And I'm probably a little ahead of myself right here. There we go. And so when I say inbox, I'm talking about Gmail inbox, your Gmail inbox. What you're going to see next are some actions that that you might be seeing in your Gmail inbox if you use Gmail. So if you have an Amazon account, you're ordering from Amazon, you might see this track package button, or you might see a view order. There's some other companies that do this. And so this is what I'm talking about. These are the actions. Clicking on these, do certain things. So clicking track package, view, they'll send you to the Amazon website. So again, here, what I'm going to talk about is adding Alfresco actions to your Gmail inbox. All right. So I'm not as prepared. So here we go. Example site. So an example is you have a site invitation. You get a site invitation. It's a simple email. You click on it, then you could go and do some stuff, right? Well, what if we can actually improve that process and actually perhaps have a button where you could click on it and you can actually accept it directly from your inbox, right? Instead of going into the email. So it speeds up the process there and allows you to do more things, right? So, or if you do open up the inbox, maybe you add a little bit of simple text up to the top, site invitation, then has some information, hit yes or no. So this is all in Gmail, right? Now, the next slide, once we get there, if we want to, instead of having those yes/no buttons, we can have a direct action button. So you hit accept invite, you just accepted the invite. Or maybe you won't, instead of that, you do view invite. So you click view invite, it'll open up your task action that's inside, or sorry, your task page within Alfresco Share. So those are a couple of different options that you have when it comes to these Gmail inbox actions. And yes, that's exactly how I feel when I figured this out. You know, when I figure out some cool things, this is how I feel. When my code works, this is how I feel, right? And you know, maybe people will relate, but yeah, it is pretty awesome, right? You can see where I might be going with this. Now, why would you want to do this? You want to do this because it helps drive user adoption. It'll help drive user engagement, speeds up process, simplify tasks, right? Simple and smart. That's where we're trying to get to. And I do talk fast, right? So how do we get there? We use addschema.org markup. This is how you add, that's how you do it. You add markup to your emails. It's currently only supported by Gmail, but there's really no reason why these other companies might not support it, because it is a collaboration between Google, Microsoft Bing, Yahoo, Yandex, and it was originally created to help index web pages. So people add these to web pages to help with the indexers. So right now, it is currently supported only by Gmail. Now, another example that I just want to show is this acknowledge button. So this acknowledge button is, you know, we always get the email that says document approved or document rejected, right? It's an acknowledgement task. You got to go and share. Now, to add that task, this is what the JSON will look like. You add this to the body of your email, and you can see the description is acknowledge, so you can really put any text in there. The second arrow shows a link, so it's just a link to an API endpoint within Alfresco. So it's that simple. And then all the rest of this stuff is just some additional metadata that's related to the markup. So So cool. So one click and you're complete. So we have a bunch of different options. We have confirm receipt. Maybe you want to just allow them to download a document directly. So you can do that. Approve, accept, invite, view, invite, et cetera, right? So that improves on this old way of processing of you get an email, open up the email, read the email, and then action upon it, go to the site. So you can see where this might make things simple and smart, and might be useful for some people's use cases, right? So another teaser here is if you actually add this metadata and you use Google search, you can get the actions to show up in your personal Gmail search results. So here I have one where it shows a review and improve workflow task. So it shows up and it just adds it in. So if we just brainstorm some things that you could do, notification workflows, add them there. Social features of Alfresco, add them there. Event management, enhancing your solutions, right? Increasing that user adoption, or implementing support for it in different applications. So how do you get started? I didn't provide a link here, but you just go to Google Developers, go to the actions in the inbox. They have a great tutorial on getting started. And then I'll be publishing a couple of articles on contentpeople.org. So thank you much.
So, hi, I'm Bramley, the Chief Scientific Officer of Ixus, and I'm going to be talking about some of the many different ways of deploying Alfresco, so different topologies, and using the tube map, so the London Underground Network map, as a visual guide. So this is a 1908 version of the London Underground map, before the heavily copyrighted and famous circuit diagram style one, and here you can see the different railway companies at the time that used to run underground. And when we're deploying distributed Alfresco clusters, we have to think about some of the fallacies of distributed computing. And as I said, there were different companies that ran the underground, so there were different styles of trains because some were cut and covered and some were drilled with tube, circle. And on the network, they have different forms of traffic, and they segregate it with signals. When we're considering IP, or the Internet Protocol, we have to handle it with sort of different zones. And typically, this is a sort of classic form of enterprise infrastructure segregation of their networks. So where are users coming in from to get to Alfresco share and the data underpinning it? Now, before I get into it, I'm going to play a game called Mornington Crescent to make it more fun. And it's from I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, which is a BBC Radio 4 panel show that's been going for a long time. And the rules are simple but obscure. So I'm going to start with a classic central line progression move. And Alfresco community we can think of as Marble Arch. It's a single standalone station, and there's a very nice monument nearby, which is where it gets its name from. As we move along the central line, the next station is Bond Street, and we can liken this to departmental Alfresco, because at this point we can offload transformations to the ATS down the Jubilee line. When you sort of go up in the world from departmental to enterprise, we can then add in another sort of node to the cluster. So we can have Bond Street and Oxford Circus as our repository nodes. We can move share up onto its own tier, so Regent's Park up the Bakerloo line. And we've got our ATS down at Green Park and our offloaded search down the other line. And this is sort of a more usual representation, but omitting load balancers for simplicity. So that's kind of standard Alfresco introducing clustering. But then you start to look at the other patterns you can use. So you can do a transfer to a file system. So taking it, in this case, from the tube network at Tower Hill onto the Docklands Light Railway of Tower Gateway. So we're taking it from the repository and pushing out the files using the file system transfer receiver. But also with the transfer subsystem, you can push it out to another Alfresco repository. So Milend gives us an example of that because we've got one set of tube lines and you can transfer to another, or back to the central line, funnily enough. And layered on top of the transfer service is the replication service. So here we've got replication of content between two different repositories at Finsbury Park. Just don't say it backwards. And that's a pun for the Londoners in the room. And with Alfresco Cloud, I like to think of this as Amersham back out in Zone 9. Again, there's a slight cloud pun there. And this is really sort of outside the firewall. which then leads us into the hybrid model, and we take it all the way from out in Cloud 9 back down the Metropolitan line to Aldgate, which is where the Ixus London office is in Zone 1. Anytime it's ready. When we start to federate across repositories, this can be compared to Paddington, where we've got multiple different underground networks, but also the mainline railway. So here we've got different silos of information, and we need to be able to find and work across them. So OpenSearch was introduced in an old version of Alfresco 2, and OpenSearch also forms some of the basis of CMIS queries. And if you want to know more on that, then you can dig out some slides I did at DevCon 3 years ago. And the main challenge with federation is how you handle workflows across different repositories, that collaboration between the people in different countries. But on the Alfresco roadmap, yesterday you saw a set of slides that were talking about the digital productivity stack. And here I've got a slightly adapted form of the diagram you saw, showing the fact that when you've got those core content and control services, this is being designed as a cloud middleware platform, and so it can federate essentially across multiple on-premise repos and the cloud repo. And when you start to get really complicated global infrastructures, you need to consider the difference between a hub and kind of a branch office. And so here we've got a hub sort of representing somewhere like Bond Street, or a branch office by Morden, which happens to be on the Northern Line, and that takes us to Mornington Crescent and the end of the game. So thank you very much.
So we're ready. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Juan Jimenez from Line of Sight. In the next couple of minutes, I'd like to share our experience so far embedding Alfresco in a Saas application. But first, let me give you a quick introduction on our pet project. A while back, we started working on an internal pet project that we wanted to implement common custom Alfresco customization and use this product sort of like a guideline for our developers that were working with Alfresco customers. But we wanted this project to have some sort of purpose. We didn't want it to be just random customizations bundled together. And we basically looked for something in our operation that needed some content management improvement and work around that. We decided to work on a platform that will simplify the process of documenting highly structured, multi-authored, and repeatable documents. We dubbed this project internally Outline. We basically, what was so special about this project? Well, think about the complexity that goes into working with this type of project, with this type of documents. You need to think about the outline, identifying the sections, identifying what needs to be fulfilled and by whom. So in order to do that, we need to implement first a repository that could segment a document into multiple subcomponents, such as the outline, images, glossary terms, and so forth, each one having its own metadata, its own ACL, and its own life cycle. This gave us the power to break down the document's content into sub-content elements that could be managed independently. They could be searched independently, reused, and cloned as well. So we implemented the content model, packaged it into an Alfresco model package, and implemented it in Alfresco, and added a service layer, an internal service layer for that repository, for that module. That service is exposed to the RESTful APIs following H2AS guidelines, Hypermedia as the engine of application state, so that basically freed us from worrying about how the client will eventually consume it. Our first step was to define an endpoint strategy. So what we did was define, consolidate actions that could be taken against the component based on endpoint schemes. So for instance, requesting a resource from the repository will follow the same endpoint, an endpoint that expects GET request, and it expects the type and ID of the requested resource. Next step that we needed to do was diagram the multiple state machines for each one of the content elements that the components will be managing. This helped us identify each one of the states and what actions and what transitions can be executed against each state at any given time. We use JSON as the state representation, providing the list of properties, name and values of the state, as well as the list of links, which provides what actions and transitions can be executed at that current state. Each resource provides a self-action link, which basically provides the client to execute CRUD methods against it using HTTP actions. Get to request the information, put and patch to modify it, and delete to delete it. Post to create new resources is handled a bit different since the endpoint differs a little. As you can see here, the endpoint expects the parent node information so that the service knows where the new resource will be created at. We started to consider implementing this component into a Saas environment, but realized that we needed to develop other components to address global functionalities. Since we already implemented a service layer around our content model, we simply designed the other components to consume its services and have those components implement its own API as well. In order to design those components, we did the same strategy. We diagrammed state machines for the other components, and we started to analyze the global functions to see how the resources interact within each other. So we noticed that some sort of orchestration and transaction management was needed. So we diagrammed sequence diagrams in order to visualize how orchestration will occur between components, and a transaction manager was designed and implemented so that we can guarantee successful transactions, as well as identifying if something fails along the way, rolling back any partial changes, and fail the execution if necessary. Account registration, activating a plan, managing content sharing options, these are just some of transaction-aware functions within the Saas environment. And finally, I don't want to leave giving the impression that this is a system that we already have in production. We currently have a beta version of the content repository, and we're in full product development of the Saas environment. Hopefully next year we can share more experiences working with this. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, this is Koorosh Vakhshoori. I work at Synopsys. We provide a software solution for designing computer chips to an external database. As you know, Activiti is the embedded workflow engine inside Alfresco. At the end of this talk, I want you to be able to list a few use cases where we need this functionality, think about one use case, how to implement and test it. Now let's talk about some use cases. So we can have a reporting system external to Alfresco that needs to run reports against workflow activities, or a dashboard that shows the status of documents in workflow. Another example would be a field inside Activiti that needs to get populated from a table inside the database. These are some of the use cases that would need this functionality. Let's consider a very specific use case. Here is the example workflow. This comes out of Alfresco. This is the one of the out-of-the-box workflow. A document gets submitted for review. A reviewer reviews it, either approves it or rejects it, and that's the end of it. What if we have additional requirement for this workflow where all the review activities needs to be logged into a database? How are we going to leverage Activiti and Alfresco to implement this functionality? Let's think about that. Now, Alfresco global property file is the central property file that Alfresco uses to configure itself. Now, Activiti can access the data inside this file via Spring dependency injection. For database connection and running, executing the queries, we can use the basic data source, class, and JDBC template. Now, for implementing the logic, we can use the Activiti listener or service task. Now, let's get into more detail. Alfresco global property file that you see here, I have put in definitions for the database connectivity. Notice I'm referring to a MySQL instance in this example. Now later on in the Activiti context file, I am defining a bin called external data source, where it's referencing the properties from the global property file. In a different section of this bin, I'm defining the listener bean, where notice here I'm referencing the external data source being defined early on. Now, how are these beans get to use by the listener code itself? Let's look at the code itself. So the setter method gets called when the class, the listener class gets instantiated. It gets the data source bean and instantiates the JDBC template. Now, when the workflow gets executed and a document gets approved, the notify method gets called, the query gets populated and executed against the database, and data gets inserted into the table in the database. Notice how simple and elegant the code is. Now, when it comes to unit testing, we need to remember a good test should be concise, should run quickly, and only test the targeted code and nothing else. Also, it should not have any dependency on external systems. Now, when it comes to writing our unit tests, let's not reinvent the wheel. Alfresco is open source. Let's see how they have done it. This abstract activity component test class is a good place to start with. Now, what are the components we need for our unit test? JUnit framework is a well-established framework for testing Java applications. Now, for our test, we don't want to have activity, Alfresco server starting and stopping every time. We want, let's look into the mocking framework technology. Mockito is the one that Alfresco uses. Let's leverage that. Now, for Spring framework support, let's check into the Spring JUnit for class runner. And for initializing our database, let's use JDBC template for that purpose. Now, when it comes to the database, our test database, we don't want to have an Oracle or a MySQL instance running for our test. That introduces dependency. Let's into embedded memory database engines. H2 is a good example for this. Now, how are these things come together when our test runs? So one thing that happens is first we initialize our schema, then record the behavior for the Alfresco services we need for the testing. When we instantiate the workflow process, then go through all the steps in the workflow. When it's done, we check the database template, table for our test record. And when that's done, we clean up and finish our test. For additional information, you're welcome to come and see me afterwards or check out my blogs. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome to Capture and Storage of Tabular Data leveraging Ephesoft and Alfresco. I'm Gary Cox, and I'm a senior consultant with Bluefish Development Group. So in the talk today, we're going to discuss a way to manage tabular data in Alfresco. We're going to use Ephesoft as our scanning solution as a source of our data, but really what we're showing in Alfresco could apply to generically. And we're going to use invoices, but really you could use any kind of tabular data. So before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about who I am. I'm with Bluefish, and we're an Alfresco Platinum partner. We've been in the ECM space for about 15 years in document management, web content, and custom application solutions. So what is tabular data? It's just a set of related data fields. I mean, typically they're grouped into rows and columns. There's many examples out there in the world, but today we're going to use an itemized invoice as our example. I've got an office supply invoice here for Initech, for Office Space fans. So the top data is pretty straightforward, right? It's just simple field mappings. You can map those to Alfresco properties pretty easily. But the bottom rows, those are all related to each other. And it presents more of a challenge for us. So it's our challenge to take this data and make it look like that. So over here you can see in Alfresco we've imported the invoice and we have our simple metadata fields imported, but at the bottom we actually have the invoice displayed as tabular data. A very small table, but it's there. Definitely a table. So I'm going to give you a quick 1-minute tour of Ephesoft, all its features in 1 minute. It features smart capture and provides a way to automatically classify and separate documents based on content, and it extracts fields using OCR. And it can be fully automated, or you can have humans involved in the process of reviewing and validating documents. They have a variety of ways to export data. We're going to use seamless export. and there's a workflow engine to maintain state. And very importantly, the data for a given batch is maintained in XML. And there are custom plugins they provide where you can write your own Java code, which is what we're going to use. So this is a capture screen, simple fields. They can be captured automatically. You can see we've extracted a bunch of simple metadata here onto the forms. And this can be validated, or if it meets certain thresholds, it can just go on and, without human intervention if needed. Also, table data is extracted, and it can be done by rules. And again, a human can validate this if needed, or if it passes muster in validation, it can just go on without intervention. So how might we model this in Alfresco? Well, we could do a brute force approach and create a property for every single possible field, which would be terrible. We could do correlated repeating attributes where we have multiple values that line up. However, we have problems with null positions in that case, with null values in that case. We could use some sort of hierarchical data with parent-child relationships. But what we decided to do was just use a custom data structure in JSON, and then use JQGrid and jQuery to display that as a custom control and share. So we're extending existing data types here. This is leveraging Alfresco's built-in functionality. We have all the goodness of lifecycle and node operations. We don't have to manage any hierarchical objects. We've reduced customizations required. It does require some customizations, but this is an example of what the data looks like behind the scenes. I have 2 rows here for red staplers and a Supreme Office chair, and that's persisted as a dtext behind the scenes. So this is easy, right? All we got to do is get a scanned document, import the document, classify it, extract the fields, validate the data, convert the table data to JSON, and use our script export hook. Then use Siemens export to map the properties to Alfresco and export everything, and then use a controller to view it. But really, it's not as bad as it sounds, right? Ephesoft provides most of what we need on its side. We just really need to customize the script export hook to write our data, to read out of their XML and write to a JSON data structure. And we're mapping to a hidden field, sorry. In Alfresco, the JSON string is persisted in a dtext property. Obviously, we don't want users to see that raw JSON, so we use a JavaScript controller is responsible for reading and writing the data. And then we use JQGrid and jQuery to actually display it as a table. This is basically just a simple architecture diagram. We have some JavaScript concludes in the share forms, and then we have a custom tabular grid FTL that talks to the tabgrid controller JS file, and it talks back to JQGrid and jQuery. So our standard controls, we just use plain old, regular old FTL controls for that, right? The simple fields are imported there, but at the bottom, we have our custom control, and you can see we've exported all the data, and it's now visible to the user, and the user can actually go in and edit that if needed. So to wrap up, this custom solution allows for exporting tables from Ephesoft to Alfresco. It provides a generic way to manage tabular data in Alfresco, even if Ephesoft's not in the picture. Tables can be viewed and edited by users, and we're using, as much as possible, standard extensions within Alfresco. The integration hooks in Ephesoft and Alfresco make this pretty straightforward to do. We'll extend functionality when you can, rather than starting from scratch. And Ephesoft and Alfresco together can be paired to provide a robust solution for importing scanned documents into your system. Thank you very much.
Okay, so today I'm going to give a little talk in my Vegas voice about how Alfresco is so much better with a Lisp. And I thought about presenting in a Lisp, but I'm not sure I'd have time, so I won't do that. You might be wondering, why Lisp? Isn't it this arcane sort of technology from the 60s? Well, there's actually a modern alternative, which is called Clojure. It's a modern functional Lisp, which uses immutable data structure. It's hosted on the JVM, and it has excellent Java interoperability. We've now launched a project called Lambdalf, which is Clojure for Alfresco. And I'm going to mostly run through a demo for the rest of the session, which shows some of its capabilities. So here we've connected to a thing called a REPL, a read eval print loop, running inside Alfresco. And here we've imported a bunch of APIs. These are actually Alfresco APIs wrapped by Lambdalf in idiomatic closure. And to test that, we'll grab company home. You can see there the node ref. It's pretty ugly, so what we'll do next is actually grab the name of company home, which is redundant. We know it's company home, but you can see how easy it is to extract properties given a node ref. So here we're grabbing CM name for company home. And there it is, no surprise, it's company home. So the next thing we'd like to do is actually do something a little bit more complicated, and actually, in this case, we're going to look at the children of company home. This is another common thing that you would do as a Java developer in Alfresco, is write a bunch of iterative code that walks through the repository and lists things out. Here, we're just pulling out all of the children of company home and getting the name property again, that CM name property. And there we have it. This is a 4.2 install, generic, no data in it yet, and those are all of the children. Another common use case for Java development is to walk a repository and do something with the data as you go. So to do that, we will define a function called walk subtree. That's the whole function there. And this function takes another function as a parameter that will do the actual operation as nodes are visited. What we're going to do is just print the name of each visited node. And there's our little print node function. You can see it pulls out that CM name property, and we'll print it given a node. So putting that all together, we can simply say walk the subtree, starting at company home, and call print node as you go. And after a bunch of stuff, you can see it's printed out all of the names of every single node in this default install that exists under company home. And that was all just one little line of code. So reads are all very interesting, but of course, most of us in our Java development are also writing data into the repository. So what we'll do is we'll create a test folder, and then we'll start putting some files into that test folder just to see that in action. So here we're going to create a node underneath company home. We're going to give it the name test. I'm very creative that way. And we're going to create it as a type of CM folder. So CM folder is, of course, the folder content type in Alfresco. Now, we didn't get much back there. We actually, in this case, we created the folder, which gave us a node ref, and the node ref has been stored in a var called test folder. We can now refer to that later on. It's like a local variable, if you will. To help us create test files, I've pasted in another function here called create test file. It just creates sort of the quick brown dog type text. It also marks it as versionable, just for, I guess, to be consistent with share. And we're going to exercise it. So we're going to create a test file in that test folder. Now, it did something, but it's hard to tell what. So let's list the children of test folder, a little bit like we did before with company home, just to make sure that it's there. And in doing that, we'll also pull out the name, so it's a little bit more friendly. And there's a file with a name of test something. If we run that create test file then a few more times and then list the children, you can see that it's adding those children, those new files, as we go. And I'm sure if any of you have written Java code that does this kind of thing, you'll appreciate how much more succinct this is. Another great way to use Clojure's native facilities is actually to explore behaviors. It's one area where I've certainly had a lot of trouble or spent a lot of time trying to figure out what behaviors Alfresco itself fires at a particular point in the repository's operation. So what we're going to do is look at the behaviors that Lambda supports, and I actually did a typo in the demo and missed an S in NS public. This is actually a Clojure function that will tell you what functions a particular package has or a particular namespace. So here we get a list of all of the ones. This is not all of the behaviors Alfresco actually supports, but it's a reasonable number of them. We can add more as we go, but this is just the set we've got. And we're going to define a little debug function that simply prints out the arguments it receives. And I think you cut my slide short. That's supposed to be 4 minutes 30.
My guess is the PowerPoint's running slow.
So the upshot from that was say no to plain old objects because you will find Clojure is a much more sophisticated mechanism. But that's literally a minute short. So
The first grade talk is up.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Craig Tan. I work I'm from Alfresco in APAC. For the next 5 minutes, we'll be talking about different ways to sync and transfer files out of Alfresco. Now, we'll get questions asked repeatedly over and over again. How do I publish some files outside Alfresco? How do I archive it? How do I collaborate outside my repository? Now, before you go out and look for partners, let's look at the different ways. So the talk is split into two parts. The green arrows are for syncing or replicating contents, meaning you can keep the contents updated in both places. The blue arrows are for transferring physical contents. So let's look at syncing first. In Alfresco, you can actually do two-way sync to the cloud, or do a one-way sync to another Alfresco instance, or the file system. So let's look at the cloud sync first. You can sync to the cloud to collaborate with people outside your firewall, and they can in turn invite more people to collaborate. Now, the on-premise person has the full control over the sync, and he can stop the sync at any time. Now, Alfresco can also provide services for you to sync to another Alfresco instance using the Transfer Service API, and you can write a program to call the API or use a replication job to schedule a date and time for the sync. Now, watch for the roadmap in the next 12 months. According to the wiki, Alfresco is planning or hoping to improve in the repo sync in areas of syncing multiple on-premise repos and do geographically distribution syncing. Now, the third point is Alfresco also allows you, using the same methodology, the Transfer Services API, to sync files to file systems. So that's pretty simple. You don't have to learn new things. So why syncing? Well, syncing is good for serving controlled contents elsewhere, or replicate contents to multiple servers for high availability, and to collaborate with external parties. Now let's look at part 2, to transfer files physically from one place to another. Now this includes importing, exporting, or simply switching the underlying physical storage in Alfresco. So Alfresco provides a content store selector where it controls which content store you actually store the file. So you can actually store the frequently used file on the fast disk and infrequently used file on maybe like a slower, less expensive disk. Now to move a file from store A to store B, all you need to do is apply an aspect to the file and then specify store B in its property name, and it gets done automatically. So it's as simple as that. Now, Alfresco also provides a bulk import tool to import file from disks into Alfresco, and it runs in multi-thread and batches. And it actually optionally replaces existing contents, but it doesn't do deletes. Now, you can bulk import folders, contents, and XML metadata, and version histories as well. And each version history can have its own content and metadata, or both. So that's pretty handy. And you can bulk import using the user interface provided by Alfresco, or write a program calling against its Java API. And you also have the option to do in-place bulk import, meaning the contents stay where they are after the import. Now, unfortunately, there is no bulk export tool counterpart for bulk import tool. And there is a JIRA for a full new import-export process. Now, cast your vote with Alfresco support if you want to see it done. So should there be a bulk export tool counterpart, then the full migration process would be completed like so. And there is a community export tool available that exports in the format of the import tool, but there's no version history. Now, Alfresco also provides a way to import and export into a package. It's effectively a zip file. So it's good for importing small sets of files, because it actually runs in one single transaction. Now, an ACP can be imported and exported via a web client manually, or via a command line tool, or programmatically using the export and import Java API. Now, an ACP is probably the closest to what we have for a full migration process. It's because it migrates files, folders, rules, ACLs, aspects, categories, permissions, and metadata. However, it doesn't do version histories and site export yet. Now, if none of the above satisfies you, there's always ways to write programs against the list of APIs that Alfresco provides. You can import file using the Siemens standard, or deal with the Alfresco specifics using the REST APIs, or get down to the lower levels of using the Java API or the Red Java Foundation API code. So that's pretty much just covered, scratches the surface of what you can do with it. Now, I've got a collection of links here for you to dive deeper into each of the individual topics. Thanks very much.
very impressive. All the speakers were very prepared, and it was excellent content. We will be posting slides on the internet so you can get the references and any videos that might be missed. And thank you. One more hand of applause for the presenters.